Okay, good evening. I'm going to call tonight's meeting together to order. Bridgewater Town Council Town Charter Changes Workshop this evening. Pursuant to Section 20 of Chapter 20 of the Acts of 2021, an act relative to extending certain COVID-19 measures adopted during the state of emergency, this meeting of the Town Council for the Town of Bridgewater will be fully remote and accessible to the public through remote participation to the greatest extent possible. There'll be no in-person attendance permitted. Citizens who wish to tune in to the meeting may do so via Zoom or Facebook Live. So we have one item on our agenda this evening. Go right to it, to Town Charter Changes Recommendations B. And so the thought process, I know that I've spoken to some of you, is looking at the Charter Review Committee and all of the recommendations and the presentation they had before the council, and some of those changes and recommendations where they sit in rules and procedures in an attempt to sort of expedite that process and help the rules and procedures members. I thought it might be helpful just to have a workshop to talk about some of the proposed changes and some of the language so that we can help the rules and procedures subcommittee figure that out and make amendments if necessary to any of the proposed legislation. So I was hoping that maybe someone, maybe Eric, maybe Frank from Rules and Procedures might have thought about a process just to kind of guide the conversation. We could attack each piece or just have a general overview of what needs to be done, but really just want to open up the floor to a general conversation.
Yeah, if I could, I'd be happy to guide us through that. I have sort of a tracker I've been using to monitor the discussion. So maybe I could steer us at least using that, if that makes sense.
Sounds great, Eric.
Okay, sure. So maybe just by way of introduction, we probably don't need it. I think all of you know this, but just to sort of frame what we're looking at in rules and procedures versus kind of the larger charter changes. So I think everyone knows, over the past 2 years, the Charter Review Committee has been soliciting feedback and made a series of recommendations on changes to the charter. And I think those changes really fall into 3 buckets. I think the first one I'll call, maybe grammar changes. So they changed terminology or spelling. The second type of change they made were relocation and formatting changes. So kind of moving things around to make it more readable. And the third type, and probably the most important, are the content changes. And those are the changes that fundamentally, I think, define or maybe redefine how our government operates. So just to frame the work that's happening in rules and procedures, that Charter Review Committee presented about 35 substantial content changes to us earlier this year. And of those, about 10 have been packaged into ordinances by Councilors George and Gallagher. And those ordinances were discussed at council and then referred to rules and procedures. And so the items that I'll guide you through today are those 10 of the 35, those 10 ordinances. Does that make sense? Any questions on that before I dive in further? Okay.
No.
All right.
Sounds good.
Perfect. Do I have the ability to share? Let me see. Okay, I don't. So I'm. Why don't I try to maybe walk us through this then? I think.
Yeah, let's give Deborah 1 second, see if you could just make Eric a co-host. Because it is helpful that if you're going through the document that yeah. Deborah, are you there?
Yes, I am. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no worries. Are you able to make him a co-host?
Who am I making a co-host?
Council Moore?
Let me figure out how to do that. Just did.
Thank you.
Perfect. All right. So I'll share just my little tracker here. Let's see. It's in a Word document. Can everybody see that?
Perfect.
Yes. Okay, great. So just to ground everyone on the columns, the first column is the part of the charter being discussed. The second column is the ordinance that was introduced to support the change. The third column is my own wording, just how I summarize the changes. I encourage everyone to look at the changes directly, just to make sure the wording is good. The third, I tried to capture how the decision or how the approval might happen. And then the fourth, I tried to map those proposed changes back to bullets from the presentation that the Charter Review Committee made to us earlier this year. And then last is just the status, and all of these right now are rules and procedures. So the first ordinance, and I think everybody has access to all of the actual ordinances. I think that was shared with the agenda.
Yep.
The first ordinance was one to essentially amend the town charter by fixing all the typographical and punctuation errors. And if you look through the document, in the version that was presented back, these are highlighted along with all edits. So you do have to kind of take a little time to look for individual words, but you'll see grammar updates, some changes to time, the table of contents, edits to make gender neutral language, and then some edits just for language consistency like Mass General Law. For the most part, I think these are straightforward. I think the only question here was whether or not we actually had to call out the individual changes, because the ordinance just sort of gives a blanket approval for anything of this type. And it may not always be clear in the actual charter what terms are actually being edited under this umbrella. So that's probably the conversation point. Just do we as a council want more clarity on content versus typographical?
Maybe we could have Attorney Rollins just briefly make a statement on that, whether this is enough in this ordinance that's proposed.
So I think I touched on this a little bit in rules and procedures. So what I had recommended the subcommittee to do is go through each one, make sure that they are truly just grammatical or standard updates throughout, just to kind of fix, typos and so on and so forth, punctuation, things like that. If that's the case, it's fine. They can be packaged as one thing in that way, citing to typographical and punctuation errors. What I worry about is if one of those words actually changes the substance of something, right? And then the state legislature might look at that a little more carefully. I haven't looked at every single typographical or punctuation error. That was essentially the conversation I had at Rules and Procedures was they should really read through these and make sure they're okay with them. And if they truly do feel, because to some degree it's what you all feel is a substantive change versus not, or if there's any question on whether or not one of these punctuation changes is substantive or not, just let me know. But certainly if it really is that benign, I think it can be packaged in that way.
Okay. Maybe if I could ask a clarifying question on that.
Absolutely.
So I think what I'm hearing is, unless we actually call something out as a question, we can assume that all of these are kind of fall under the approval given by this ordinance. Is that right, Jason? And it's up to us to call out an exception. Am I hearing that?
Clarify that a little. I'm not following the question.
So I guess I'm just wondering, how do we turn the advice you just gave us into something that we action?
Okay. So the way you do it is, so you've created the proposed ordinance, right? So that exists. You take I'm assuming the proposed ordinance cites to like an exhibit A, which will show these punctuation and typographical corrections. You're gonna take that, you're gonna read through it, and that's what's gonna come back before the council for debate. And I would expect that, whoever proposes that particular ordinance has read through what the proposal actually is from the Charter Review Committee and knows exactly what punctuation and typographical edits are being made. And so once that gets back there, yeah, that's fine to do it that way. But yeah, that's what the process should look like. So I think what you've done here is you've taken the proposed ordinances and you've kind of summarized them. And I think it's fine to package them this way. In fact, I think it's probably preferable for you all. But it needs to come back up to the council after someone has actually gone through and looked at, okay, what are the typographical and punctuation changes that are being proposed here by the Charter Review Committee? Because at the end of the day, they're just making recommendations to you all. You all have to legislate. So you should know exactly what legislation you're proposing. So that's the way I'm looking at it. Does that answer your question, or you have something more to it?
It does. The current ordinance doesn't have an exhibit. It's just a
Exactly.
statement. So I think if we add the exhibit.
You have to.
So
You absolutely have to, because things can turn, as you know, in the charter on a single word. So whoever's proposing it, and I would recommend this to all of you when it gets to the point of actually going before the state legislature as a special act at some point, you all should really read what you're proposing be changed. And I'm not saying that any of these changes are substantive, but you may feel they are, right? And there may be an issue about that down the road. I can tell you, in many years doing this, we've had issues hang on one word. So you want to be very, very careful with the semantics. And absolutely, there needs to be an exhibit attached that goes through the exact things that are going to be changed.
Okay.
the question.
Counselor Wood?
So I read through the markup version of the charter that was provided. And so I couldn't understand, based on this ordinance, are we thinking that we would accept the modification that now we have a definitions section, which used to be section 1.9, move to the top of the charter, and that all these new terms fall under this fixing all the identified topographical and punctuation errors? Is this something that comes under that heading, or is it covered somewhere else?
I think you guys can do it however you want to organize it. My big concern with that, and in what you're referencing, I noticed, and I don't think it was obviously intentional by the Charter Review Committee, but I noticed that some of their edits were made to the previously edited version that actually failed at voting, right? So as you all recall, it went to the ballot and the changes failed. So I noticed that some of the newest red lines were red lines to that version. We need to be redlining the current version of the charter and not the proposed amended version of the charter that failed at the ballot last time. So that's another thing to keep in mind. So what I had suggested at Rules and Procedures is they take the document that Charter Review had created, which I can't recall if it's in this context where it was actually a red line of a red line. But if it is, it's not the end of the world, but you just need to match it up against what the actual charter says. And the actual charter language is what needs to be redlined. From there, if you need to add, because you're adding a definition section and it doesn't really fit in line with another section in the charter, absolutely, we're going to have to figure out, are we going to do an Article 1-2A, so yeah, that can absolutely be part of what we discuss, but you all need to propose that, and then we start the legislative process, right? I'm happy to give any suggestions for anything that's proposed, but I certainly don't want to legislate for you all. So, whatever you propose, we can make work. And if it makes more sense for there to be a definition section up front, then I'm sure we can figure that out.
Okay, Eric?
Yeah, I guess given that, I'm wondering, just in terms of the overall approach, right? One approach is to sort of take this maybe subsection by subsection or content area by content area, which is sort of what we're doing. The other might be to just look at a section like definitions, come up with some language around that, have that section be the exhibit, and sort of approve them section by section. And I was just wondering if there was any opinion just on that general approach versus the one that we're talking about right now, which is a statement about the whole document.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think the issue with that is I think the intent here was to kind of separate out a few of the items that you all felt, or at least some of you all felt, wouldn't ultimately have to go to the voters. And so the only issue with doing that is some of those sections there are proposed changes in here that will relate to some of those other sections. Some maybe not, but some there will be. And if you're looking to change that in some substantive way, I would say that should be packaged a certain way. So I think you organized this where you did a few things so that it could go through without going to the legislature as a special act, because technically under our form of charter, you can actually make some of these changes without them being voted on by Bridgewater. But it looked to me like there were some other things that might be a little more controversial, or you all want the voters to weigh in on. And so I think the difficult part of going section by section is that you could conceivably have a section whereby you all vote a charter change, but then that same section may also be changed later by another charter change that gets approved by the voters. So it could get very complicated in that way, right? You could almost get contradictory things. So I think that's why they grouped them this way, to kind of say, okay, these things are separate and distinct from these other things. And I don't think it's a section by section thing. I think it's more just a substance by substance thing. And at least that's what I'm reading into what I see here. Obviously, you know, who I know, Councillor George and Councillor Gallagher proposed it. So if I'm reading into it wrong, absolutely let me know. But I think that was the intent.
Okay. Councilor Georgia Gallagher, any comment? Oh, sorry, I didn't see your hand.
Yeah, I never used the hand thing, but I figured out.
I'll let Dennis go first.
I figured out how to do it. Thank you, Mr. President. Yeah, I mean, as far as the first one we're talking about here is, there wasn't any backup that we submitted regarding this, because we were simply referring what the Charter Review Committee had recommended for the typographical and punctuation errors. As Councilor Wood pointed out, there is a red line version on, I think, the town website of what the Charter Review Committee was identifying as typographical and punctuation errors. And as the town attorney has indicated, is that it appears that maybe they were looking at something that was proposed and failed, you know, 2 or 3 years ago. But I mean, I looked at those typographical and punctuation errors, and I didn't see anything in there that simply, you know, changed a policy or anything. It was simply identifying words that were spelled wrong or punctuations that weren't where they were. So that's why that one was submitted. So I think, right, we need to take a closer look at what was redlined, but I think this was a simple one to put forward, just to simply change what was spelled wrong and put the grammar correctly. And this one, in my opinion, yeah, I think this is something we could keep within the council. I don't think this really needs to go to the voters unless there are some typographical punctuation errors that would significantly change a policy, but I didn't see that.
Okay.
Yeah, I would agree with Council Gallagher. This was more of us passing along all of the, you know, Scribner errors, things of that nature, not looking for this particular ordinance to make any changes to the charter in its current form outside of the other things that are being proposed in the other ordinances. So to Attorney Rollins' point, and this is where, for me personally, it gets a little tricky, is our intent versus what the results are can be a little tricky, you know, specifically from the perspective of what we're trying to accomplish. So
I mean, one suggestion I might have for you is that you take the typographical and punctuation changes that, you know, you find to be benign and not substantive, that don't relate to those sections which could conceivably change under one of these other charter changes, and you dispense with those quickly. You see what I mean? Because now you've separated out the sections that may have more complex questions or changes. And you can make the punctuation and typographical changes within those sections on those other changes, right? I just worry you're going to change something in the typographical and punctuation section, and then there's going to be a charter change of a whole section, right? That might even change terms or words, and it could end up contradicting what you did in the typographical section. So it's not an easy exercise. I mean, there has to be a deep dive into what specifically is getting changed and how it relates to the things within the charter itself. So I think packaging it is a good idea. I think doing it the way that you're proposing to do it is a good idea. I think what really is going to happen is there has to be a deep dive. Maybe you guys separate it out per counselor kind of thing, so not one person is doing everything, into each one of these proposed things, and then have a robust discussion about each of these things, right? Because once you get to a consensus, we can cross-check and make sure whatever we think that consensus is doesn't contradict something else that we could change by a further charter change. So that's my only concern in that way. But I think, you know, other than that, you guys have the right idea.
Council Wood?
Yeah, so I didn't see, you know, I understand what Councilor Gallagher was saying, but it would have been helpful, I think, to see, you know, an artifact attached to the ordinance that identified the items. And I know this was a starting point, I get it. But I think we have to, if there's no strategy change or implementation change, these are really grammatical updates, and you know, a table of contents would have been nice in the beginning, and gender neutral language is easy to find. You know, then it should be that we have a list of deletes and insert, right? Which is how you see any amendment done at the state level. You know, delete this language, insert this language, and it should be a definitive list that's easy to see as we go forward. Because as you know, my concern would be also, you know, that we're inserting language for a definition that changes the definition, how it gets used in the charter overall, things like that. Computational time, I didn't even see that yet in what I was looking at. So, you know, the delete and insert pairs would be awesome, I think, as a goal.
Okay, makes sense. It sounds like we have some direction there. As a takeaway, do we have one of the sponsors willing to do that exercise? I imagine that Ed Evaldi is here, and I imagine that he probably already has that document readily available through their own process. So it'd just be going through those edits.
Can I talk?
Oh, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Okay, so the purpose of this was to get something to the Rules and Procedures Committee.
Yep.
And I didn't, and Councilor George and I, you know, we got together a couple of times just to look at these things and get something to Rules and Procedures, because when the Charter Review Committee came to the council, you know, nothing was done. Now, it just sat around and it's like, well, when is it the normal procedure? And again, we haven't had too many charter reviews. This is only the second one. So we needed to get what the charter review did to the Rules and Procedures, because that's where the work needed to be done. So yeah, is this incomplete as an ordinance? Well, sort of, but there is a red line version of all the work the Charter Review Committee did on the website. And I think that, you know, the Rules and Procedures Committee should take that document, look at it and cross-reference it to the changes that we're trying to adopt here. If that's what the purpose was to do. I wasn't trying to say, okay, I'll just, I wasn't going to do all the work. I was saying, okay, we have a committee to look at this. Let's set some guidelines. They might change it. They might, we got 9 other things to go through tonight, but this was like Council Wood said, this is a starting point just to get the conversation going. And I understand the rules and procedures is probably the toughest committee on the council. It's a lot of work, and there's a lot of things that have been sent to them recently. So I certainly can understand that.
So if I could just step in. So, I think from the intent of what we're trying to accomplish here, from my perspective, and this is just one member of the Rules and Procedures Committee, in the discussions that we've already had, I don't think there was any intent whatsoever of us making any substantive changes to anything that was proposed by the Charter Review Committee. What I thought our goal was, and now this is being expanded, I think, to something that personally I'm going to ask for resources, because now we're getting to minutia in regards to intent versus execution, unintended consequences. I mean, I really think that we need to have in Rules and Procedures something where we're looking at it and saying, okay, what we have in front of us, are there any recommended changes? I'm a little taken aback at things that are being put into Rules and Procedures that now the heavy work needs to be done. I don't necessarily know if that's the intent, nor are we equipped for that. So if you look at some of the other things, some of them are pretty straightforward in regards to the intent, right? What they're doing and what we're proposing the process is. We've just spent 27 minutes on the first ordinance. And now with Attorney Rollins saying, we've got to go in and really map out this entire thing. Personally, I don't think that I'm qualified to do that solely, because as we've seen in the current charter, what the intent versus what the actual verbiage is and what's being laid out, it doesn't jive. And we took the original charter from another town. So, maybe that town needs to make some changes as well. So I understand what's being said, but now from that, if we're going into, syntax, commas, putting together anything else, then, I personally think we need to get some resources involved to try to help us through that. That's my personal opinion. I don't know how the rest of the committee feels.
Well, Sean, I appreciate your comments, and I think that I'm hopeful that the 27 minutes that you refer to that we just spent is going to save us untold amount of hours doing something wrong or not the right way. And that's the intent of tonight, to get that on board. And I only meant to offer that out as the sponsors of the bill, if you had an interest in that, whether it goes back in its Rules and Procedures. I think that with a lot of the changes here, that Rules and Procedures needs to lean on the town attorney. And if not, if we need a funding source to get some administrative assistance to work through these, I think that's probably something we have to do. I mean, we're all volunteers working full-time jobs, and there's a lot of work that has to be done. To your point, we can't even get past the first one in trying to lay out what the next few steps are going to look like. So I appreciate that. I'm just trying to, as we move through one, understand, okay, who's taking ownership and what is the next step, so that we at least continue to see progress. Anyone else? I think Councilor Moore.
Yeah, I could just say, as a takeaway from this, I can take ownership of this and drive the rest of the conversation around resources and ultimately creating, I think, the artifact that rides along with this first one. So I can be the point person on that. But I think, to Councilor George's comment, we probably do need some help, and I'll come up with an ask for that.
Definitely. I don't think there's anybody here that doesn't think that you're not going to need the help, and would fully support that as well in Rules and Procedures.
Thanks.
I would say that
the most important part for you all is to figure out the intent behind the legislation that you're proposing. It isn't to make sure that the way it's written is perfect. I can help you with that, but it's the intent. I can't help you with that because it's not my role to tell you how to legislate. And I shouldn't be doing that. I'm not on the town council. You all are. So I think that's really the key. There's a big distinction between, making sure that it's written perfectly and understanding the intent behind the changes you're proposing. And I think for you all, really, you don't have to worry about a perfectly written ordinance, because I know some of you have sent me ordinances in draft form that have your intent, and I will make it palatable, but you have to know the intent. That's the key. And no resource, no one can help you all figure out what intent you have behind the legislation you want to propose. And so that's, I think, where the rubber meets the road. So it's a matter of intent. And I wouldn't worry so much about the painstaking kind of task of making sure it's written in a proper way. But I can't rewrite these things without knowing your intent. That's the key. And it's not proper for me to. It's not proper for anyone but the legislatures to tell me what the intent of their changes are. So that's what if that's helpful, I think that's food for thought when you're doing this. Is think about what is your intent. You have a certain goal, that certain thing you want to have changed, and that's what you have to know. Not so much how does it need to be written, but why it's being written. And I think that's the key.
Should I move on to the second one? Any additional discussion on this one?
Yes, we'll circle back.
All right, perfect. I think this one, so the recommendation from the charter review was, this is about an absence of the town manager. And the recommendation was that if they're going to be out for 30 days or less, they would appoint somebody from their department heads to act in their place. And if it was beyond 30 days, the council president, I believe, or the town council would appoint somebody. And then it also has kind of some language about, the town manager can't appoint somebody who goes beyond a certain time. So I think the ordinance here is a little different from the recommendation. So I think this one does probably have some discussion.
Talk about this one.
Yeah, I can pause yet. Dennis, do you want to talk us through this?
Yep. Again, if I could, this one here is, I think, hopefully much more simple than the first one. And the intent here is that I've mentioned the role of the assistant town manager a lot. And I think that the term assistant has a meaning to it. It has a meaning to it in government. It has a meaning to it in the private sector. And I think that we didn't have an assistant town manager when the charter was first written. I don't even think we had an assistant town manager 3 or 4 years ago, but we have an assistant town manager now. And I think that that position, should be ready to act in the absence of the town manager if he or she is not in the office. I think that should be the role of the assistant town manager. And that was the intent of including that as an alternative to just a department head. The intent was to clarify who that person should be. And that was the intent of me putting the assistant town manager should act as the town manager in the absence of the town manager. That was the intent. It's pretty simple. And I don't think this needs to go to the voters. I think this is something we can approve at the council level.
Thank you, Councilor Wood.
Yeah, I was a little confused by this one. I understand the intent, and Dennis is spot on. There was no assistant town manager, and there wasn't for years because we just couldn't find one, and it wasn't until the administrative code that we actually put one in. I see a couple challenges here. One is the charter doesn't talk about an assistant town manager in any way. in terms of powers or anything else. That's something we've created through the administrative code. And so I don't disagree that if we have an assistant town manager, that by default, it should fall, the powers during the absence should fall to the assistant town manager. But it's not defined in the charter now, and that's the gap. And so when we had it before, a department head, you could say, like, using the example we have now, our assistant town manager is the HR department head. So it could be assigned to that person right now. But the second piece is that the second piece of this is about the approval process and the appointment process. And I would hope to see that it's, not just an appointment by the council president, but a broader appointment process, just like we do with many of the other appointments that we bring before the council.
Yeah, but Bill, this to me, and Dennis, keep me honest here. This is in regards to a leave of absence. This isn't an appointment, a permanent appointment. So as it stands right now, if the town manager goes on a leave, then the way it's structured is a department head becomes the de facto town manager. I think what we're trying to say is, in the current form, if the town manager goes on a leave, the assistant town manager becomes the town manager, the interim town manager, until such time that the town manager returns, or if he or she doesn't return in 30 days, then we go through the process of appointing a permanent town manager. I think that's where we're trying to get to, which would make sense. And as it was pointed out, you couldn't put that in the original charter because we didn't have an assistant town manager.
Well, we're talking about section 4.7 here, temporary absence.
Right.
This specific thing. And so there is a section in today's charter, and the red line from the CRC reads similar to what is written here in the ordinance, but not exactly what's on the ordinance. So what I'm saying is there's no definition of assistant city manager. And the temporary absence can still be a person from department heads when the city manager is absent for 30 days. So that was the recommendation in the red line version, slightly different from this 4.7 that's in here, because now it does include the assistant, which we didn't have defined prior to the administrative code.
So just in terms of next steps, then, should we? I think everyone is aligned on the intent that if there is a mechanism to push it to the assistant town manager, that is the preference. And we just have to make sure that the language supports that. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. One other
recommendation, but is the recommendation from the CRC the language or a person from the department heads? Are we abandoning that, or are we keeping that?
I think we could.
My understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, was it would fall to the assistant town manager. If for whatever reason the assistant town manager couldn't act in that capacity, then the council president gets to appoint an interim or temporary town manager. So, that's the way I understand the intent, but I could be wrong.
The only other thing too, I would, you guys might want to think about is, could appoint from current employees, or could appoint from current elected officials, or could appoint from someone outside working in the private industry. I mean, you just, again, you want to be careful how you craft it. That's a lot of authority without any ratification process. So certainly the idea of it falling to an assistant town manager, that's easy enough. But then once you all are getting into the appointment process, what do I would say you probably want to be specific, right? You want to figure out appointment from what, I mean, it could be from anyone. I think that's up to you, but I think that's probably something else to think about. Let's just make sure we have it as specific as possible, so that, if it does happen, you guys know exactly what to do.
Okay. I think we could wordsmith this one to align with the discussion. And to be specific enough where it's clear what we want to do. I don't think we need to discuss these other items today, but I just want to put them on the radar because they've come up. I think there is some confusion about the last statement in this proposed wording where it says no person appointed by the city manager can serve more than 21 calendar days without approval of the city councilor or city council. But earlier it said that the city manager may appoint somebody if they're going to be absent for 30 days or less. So like there's this sort of interesting thing where they can appoint someone, but that person can't serve the full term for the 30 days. So we just need some clarity there. And then the other is, I think we were asked or recommended that we provide some clarity on who gets to decide whether a leave of absence has started and ended, just to make sure that there isn't confusion with that. So I can take the action on this one to come up with some revised wording that we can look at and discuss. Anything else on this before we move to the next one?
The only other thing you may want to look at is, so how long would you be saying, if it's, obviously this is for a leave of absence, how long would the leave of absence be good under the appointment of just the president? And if there was a requirement for a subsequent appointment by the entire council, when would that occur? How does that occur? So whatever that process looks like, I would just say, make sure you touch on. It could just be the council president, which is fine. But if you're going to have a different process and say after a certain amount of time, the town council gets to ratify the person, I would just say, make sure you say that.
Okay.
I also noticed you didn't, none of this took into account section 4.6, which is vacancy in office. There was only one significant change in that, but it did impact us years ago. So the change was from 3 to 6 months for how long we could appoint in the vacancy, during the vacancy. So is this article gonna pull that in as well, or is that, because I don't see that on any of the other measures here.
I don't believe that was a recommendation from the Charter Review Committee.
No,
Yeah, but this is why I'm
Bill-
confused, because it's in the markup.
but no.
Is the intent different? Is that like a town manager who up and quits?
Right.
The length of appointment versus what we're talking about right now is like the town manager coming to us and saying he's
Yes.
taking FMLA.
It's a different type of vacancy.
Yes,
You may want a charter change specifying that, right? Just, I think your point is well taken. Maybe you want a charter change just specifying 4.6 is for this type of, there's some implication obviously there, but it's not explicit. So that might be something to look at just to make sure it all works right.
Okay.
Okay. Anything else on this one before I move on? Okay. So the next one, there is some language around library trustees in section 3.2. This one actually had a pretty significant expansion, and the bullets were essentially to clarify roles and responsibilities and put a little more information about what that group can do. So if you haven't already looked at it, I'd encourage you to. There are other paragraphs, many more paragraphs than there were before. But in here, at least to me, it seemed like it was just bringing more specifics to the role and a better understanding of what that role could do and how those roles get, how you select a leader, that sort of thing. Any discussion on this one? Okay.
Yes.
Counselor Wood.
So using this one as an example, is this the type of thing where we would want this item to go to the voters? Maybe the same as the others, but this is substantial changes. It may make sense just to strike the whole section 3.2 and replace it with the new section.
So what I'd like to, for Attorney Rollins is, if rules and procedures brings things back with the recommendation of either it not going to the voters or going to the voters, the town council, in its final approval, can change it, correct? So we're not the final say. So Bill, to your point, if this comes back with the recommendation, it doesn't go to the voters, but the council feels that it should, it can be changed at the council level, correct?
Yes, 100%. Yep.
So I think, Bill, to your point, through all of these, we'll make a recommendation, to the voters or not. But the council is the ultimate decision-making authority if it happens or not. If it goes to the voters or it doesn't, I should say. Because go ahead, I'm sorry.
And to Mr. Wood's point, just too, when you're looking at terms of office, you're looking at elected parties, whether they be the town council or otherwise, it's preferable for that to go to the voters because you're talking about things that relate to elected officials that are going to be elected by the town. So it probably isn't a bad idea.
Yeah, and when Dennis and I got together, we didn't agree on some of them if they should or they shouldn't go in front of the voters, but ultimately it wasn't our decision to determine that. It's the council's decision.
Yep.
Okay, anything else on this beyond the putting it in front of the voters or not? Anything on the content of the change? Okay. So I'll go to the next one.
Sorry, one other thing.
Sorry.
So there was a lot of discussion, Eric, over the years about who can be on a library trustee and who can't. And there was language about the fact that I think someone in the school could not be a library trustee. Does this section, is this going to eliminate that provision? Because many of us didn't see any conflict before.
I don't remember seeing that constraint in the language.
Yeah, I didn't see it.
And technically, anyone who works for the schools is not a town employee. Usually we're running into
Well, the thing about
prohibits for town employees, not for the school district.
right, but it was there's a section, I'll have to look it up, but there is a section that talks about the school employees can't be, pointed to. Here it is. Okay, so it says under Article 3, Section 3.1 of our current charter, says that to be eligible, a person shall not simultaneously hold any other elected or appointed town office or be employed by the town or Bridgewater Rainham Regional School District in any capacity. And so that paragraph made it so that if you were a teacher, you could not be a library trustee. And there was some, some issues surrounding that. So I never saw a conflict of that. I think teachers would make excellent library trustees, and I just want to make sure the language was cleaned out.
Yep. Dennis?
I think, thank you. But Council Wood, you're referring to a different section of the charter about eligibility and term of office. This does not deal with that. This deals with the role of the library trustees. Right? I mean, you're referring to a section of the charter that doesn't talk specifically about library trustees. It talks about eligibility for any town employee. This is specifically a role of the library trustees. There was an awful lot of redlining on this one, as I'm sure you've all seen. Awful lot of redlining on this. And this was to clarify the role of the trustees, not eligibility, so to speak.
Any other questions? Okay, so I did take down a note to get some clarity on that. And I think if there is a restriction in another section, we could bring it up as a separate discussion.
Yeah, you can make a charter change striking that one part of section 3.1. If you wanted to, obviously.
Yeah. Just making a note of that. Okay. All right, the next one, this is the global change where all references that use the term town would change to city. And you see that in many of the other sections as well. I'm paraphrasing here, but the general recommendation was to make the change to bring the charter up to date with our legal form of government, recognizing that the charter will probably be in place for the next 10 years. They thought that it was a little bit of future proofing with the note that we can still use the word town for external communications if desired. So I think this was more about just getting consistency in the charter, although certainly it could have a bigger impact than just that.
Yeah, I had weighed in on this a little bit in rules and procedures, and there are some kind of unintended consequences to it. So one good example is you all are doing what is called re-precincting right now. And towns have precincts, but cities do not. So you would actually have to make other changes to the charter if you decide to call us a city as opposed to a town, because cities have wards and towns have precincts. We probably wouldn't have any issues keeping the same maps, but you've done an awful lot of work with the precincting. And so I'm just giving you one example. It does come up every now and again statutorily where there is a distinction between what a city is and a town is. We're kind of in this strange in-between existence where we have what's considered a city form of government, but in some ways we're still technically a town. So we've grown accustomed to operating that way. So it's not like it's not difficult to operate that way. So I would just say, make sure there's a real incentive to change it, because it could change other things and it could require further, charter changes. So if that's, something you all want to do, we can certainly look into more of what other consequences changing it will have. But I know for a fact it'll have consequences relative to the way we call our areas, right? Precincts versus wards. It may have some other consequences with how elections are held. But then there are other areas where mass general laws will actually lay out these separate kinds of governments. And there's actually a few different ones. And we're not unique in how we do it. I think Amherst has the same form of government as us. Franklin has the same form of government as us. So there are other towns that do this the same way, but I don't believe any of them have changed over to terming themselves as cities. I don't think Amherst is considered a city. I think it's still a town, and same with Franklin. So there will be other consequences. So it's not as simple as just saying, let's just call it a city because, we're kind of close to a city form of government. There are, in mass general laws, a lot of the time, it'll give you several different ways to do something, and it'll kind of specify by your form of government which way you do that. And so it could create some ambiguity. So just so you know that, for what it's worth.
Maybe I saw Fred. Did you have some thoughts on this?
I do, if we are here to discuss the relative merits of the proposed legislation. And in that regard, as I see it, I certainly, we are all well aware, I think many in town are well aware that we have a city form of government, notwithstanding that the title of our municipality is the town of Bridgewater. I don't know that there's any tangible benefit to the change that's proposed in this ordinance. And I do see that there are a number of potential downsides, some of which Attorney Rollins has just alluded to. Frankly, I just don't see it. And I'll go a step further, that I know that the council all received communications by email. One party to which was Mr. Ivaldi, the chairman of the Charter Review Committee. And he emphasized the need to achieve consistency by adopting the term city in lieu of town. And he went on to point out that nonetheless, it wouldn't impact a lot of, day-to-day occurrences of the word town. In other words, we wouldn't be changing town signage and town stationery and town vehicles and the town seal. He didn't mention all of these, but in other words, these outward depictions, if you will, of the word town wouldn't change. But in any formal and legal context, he is saying that we would use the word city. And that's just what's proposed in the ordinance. And I think that rather than to quash any inconsistency, I think that simply gives rise to far greater inconsistency. And I think it's the kind of ambiguity that would really cause people to scratch their heads. And again, I do believe there would potentially be some ramifications that are, including some that are unforeseen by us right now. That's just my view on the subject overall.
Thank you, Councillor Chase. Councillor Wood?
Thanks. Wonder how we take those hands down. Lower hand, there we go. All these new tricks we're learning. That was excellent, the way Councillor Chase presented that. I agree with him. This isn't my first rodeo through changes to the charter. We spent many hours doing what the rules and procedures are doing. We were in your seats, 6 years ago, going through the minutia of all the changes. And when I get to a change like this, I kind of sit back and I say, okay, what is the value to the people this impacts? What is the value to the town council? What is the value to the town of Bridgewater? And I just, when I measure it against other things, I just don't see value here. I get that it could be consistent, but we've already always said we're a city known as the town of Bridgewater. And I think, and Councillor Chase pointed out Ed's email from last night, and I'll just read a short section from it. Everybody got a copy of that one. It said that it really comes down, and this is from Ed, quoting, "It really comes down to a matter of preference and local sentiment. Most of the council manager governments that were towns prior to the adoption of a charter providing for a city form of government continue to identify as towns. Franklin, Winthrop, Braintree, Barnstable." And I know there are more. I've done some research myself on this subject. And so I look at something like this and I just don't see how it adds value to the intention of what we want to try to accomplish in the charter changes. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Wood. Anyone else? Okay. Just my own thoughts on this. I agree with both Councillor Wood and Councillor Chase. I think I certainly understand how it makes it easier, maybe in the charter, to sort of follow city versus town. But beyond that, I am concerned that it introduces unexpected consequences. And so I also, I'm not sure I've heard a strong argument for why this one is needed compared to some of the others where there are fundamental changes to the way that we govern. this one is an enormous change that seems to have less impact. Any other thoughts on this before we move on? Okay. I'll move on to the next one then. This next one, I think a lot of the language, once somebody's elected, I think it's 2 weeks after they sort of start serving. And this changes that to the next business day following the election. Any comment or thoughts on this one? Councillor Wood?
Yeah, in the last changes, we argued heavily for this change also. You know, in our form of government, it doesn't make sense to have a time lag, especially when the positioning of the election is right in the middle of the budget cycle. And so if you lose people or gain people, you want those people, they may have, you know, been a candidate based on a position on the budget. They need to be impactful in that cycle. So we before said, you know, it was a good idea. I continue to think it's a good idea. I will point out there's an inconsistency in that it says it in the town council. I mean, it says it in the council section. It says it in the trustees section, but it didn't get changed in the town clerk section. And the clerk section still says the second Monday following.
Okay.
Another note, I think, Mr. Wood, I think it was you at the last full council meeting. We had discussed the possibility of actually having this charter change come as part of the charter changes necessary for the re-precincting. So if it is something that there's a general consensus on, it may be something you guys can get knocked off your list maybe a little more quickly, just part of our re-precincting process. Just some food for thought.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, any additional thoughts on this one? Okay, so we'll work to clarify language and push this one through. The next one is about the town council term limits. And if I read this one correctly, and I think I might need some guidance on this from others who have had discussions, but I think the new language sets this up as a councillor cannot serve for more than 4 elections, 4 terms. But that is 4 terms in one of the 2 types of councillors that we have. So 4 terms as a district councillor. And then the language also seems to imply that you can then still do 4 terms as an at-large councillor. So that's the language that's before us. That's my understanding. Maybe first, is there anyone who could clarify their understanding? Councillor Gallagher?
Thank you. This ordinance brought forward by Councilor George and I, we didn't add anything to this. We were simply just bringing forward the recommendation from the Charter Review Committee to get the discussion going. So here we are. Here's an opportunity to put this issue to bed. And whatever recommendation comes out of the rules and procedure, we will certainly have another debate about this. I mean, some people think there should not be term limits. Some people think there should be term limits. The Charter Review Committee appears that they think there should be some sort of term limits on town councilors, and that's fine. So I think that something should go to the voters, and the voters should make the choice whether to do away with term limits or adopt something similar to what has been presented by the Charter Review Committee.
Thank you, Councilor Gallagher. Any other thoughts on this one?
If I may, Councilor Moore?
Yep.
I'm just curious about the language that we see in the proposed ordinance tonight. And it seems to me that, if I'm correct, that it differs from the language that was actually presented to the full council by the Charter Review Committee. If I'm correct, I just didn't recall having seen previously the language that refers to prior service and carving that out as an exception.
I think that is, yeah.
That was as part of the original.
I think
charter?
so. I think so.
Yeah, it's E bullet 3. I can read it briefly. It says, for the purpose of this section, prior service as an at-large counselor shall not prevent seeking election as a district counselor. Prior service as a district counselor shall not prevent seeking election as an at-large counselor.
Well, if I may say, I believe that the language you've just read is actually much clearer than the language that appears on the version that we've received circulated in connection with this meeting tonight. I think it really dispenses with the ambiguity that I'm looking at on my screen.
And I also think you probably should even make it more explicit and, make clear what you can serve this many as district and this many as at large. I would make it that clear, that specific, because again, this is an issue that comes up, in any ambiguity, any potential to make an argument one way or another about intent is what leads to, issues with how we have to interpret things. So I would be even more explicit. I mean, I would be as explicit and clear as you can be. That way there's no confusion about what the voters are voting on and what you all are sending to the legislature, if you decide to do that.
Great. Thank you, Attorney Rollins. Any other comment on this? Councilor Wood?
So I did notice, just like Councilor Chase did, so that the language of the ordinance is different than the markup language. So the language of the ordinance actually seems to say that after 4 elections, you can't go forward, but then you could skip a year and come back, in a new election cycle, as opposed to anything else. That the other one is quite limiting. I've always seen it as, everybody knows my position on this, on term limits. If the people see that a candidate's doing a good job, they vote for him. If they think that someone else has a better story, they vote for that other person, and the right person fits the seat. I don't think we have to have the artificial, cap on how many elections or how many, as a friend of mine said, what happens after 12 years? Do you become corrupt after 12 years? Do you become corrupt on the 5th election as opposed to the 4th or 3rd? It's one of these things. I just don't see any value to the town to limit this, but it is inconsistent in what's presented here in the ordinance and what's presented in the markup of the charter. And I think we need to get, an exact language structure. And you can also, Eric, look at Barnstable. Barnstable actually changed their language. Their language was similar to ours. I think that our original language probably came from Barnstable, and they changed their language. It does retire people, but if the voters want to bring it back, they can.
Great.
And again, I would just say, what we have here, Councilor Gallagher and Councilor George were nice enough to kind of package these things and get them out so you guys could start this discussion. But certainly, if there are proposed charter changes that contradict the ones that are here or that are different, people should be proposing those. I mean, if we're going through a process, we should go through the process. And certainly, if your ability to put charter changes on your agenda is certainly not limited to simply what the Charter Review Committee proposed. So I just want to, I know you all know that, but I think that's an important point, not trying to give anyone more work to try to propose legislation. But if, obviously, if you have ideas that are completely different or not in any way related to these, you all can certainly propose them. So just some food for thought.
Any other comments on this one before I move on? Okay, so we'll work to clarify the language on this one in rules and procedures. Moving on to the next one, this is the one that provides for an annual stipend of $3,000. That also states that it can be amended by a 2/3 vote by the council after that, and it doesn't start until 3 years after being voted on. Any discussion or comment on this? Councillor Gallagher?
Yeah, thank you. I think that maybe I'm wrong, but I thought that the last sentence there was not part of the proposed ordinance. But anyway, I don't
You
know.
are right.
Okay, so that was, okay, so
Yeah.
I really think that, I think this obviously should go to the voters to decide whether we deserve a stipend or not, obviously. But I do think that if the voters approve it, I don't think there should be a wait period. That's just my thought. But if rules and procedures think there should be a 3-year wait period, then that should be before the voters as well. I'd like to see the number be like $6,000, not $3,000. And when it comes back from rules and procedures, I'll probably propose that amendment. But I do think that the councilors do deserve a stipend. I mean, my years of serving the town, there's certainly more years behind me than ahead of me, so I'm not going to become a rich man on this. But I do think that we all deserve some sort of stipend for the work that we do. I think it should be more than $3,000 and let the voters decide. So I'll make that amendment when it comes back from you guys, but I don't think there should be a wait period. Doesn't matter to me, but.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Was that wait period related to the amendment in the future? Is that why? Because it comes after the sentence that says can be amended in future by 2/3 vote of the council. I mean, certainly
The amount.
right,
We can
certainly,
amend our own stipend.
yeah, that I think is problematic. So I think maybe the 3-year wait period was based off of that. See what I mean?
Well,
So
okay.
basically,
Yeah.
I'm not
Yeah,
positive, but I think that's what was going on there.
If I can explain my recollection, and of course, we had a different town attorney at that point, was that because we have to vote to recommend this to go to the state and come back, even though it gets voted by the people here in Bridgewater, the concept was that we would not be voting for our own stipends if we made it 3 years out. But I could argue, just as like Dennis has argued, if we're turning it over to the town to vote on, then why have a wait period?
I can see both sides of the argument. I think, though, when you have the state legislature and the voters vote it, you're actually not technically in control of what that vote is. So I think you're okay for you all. What my issue is the ability of future councils to be able to amend it by a 2/3 vote. That is a problem. That can't happen.
You take that out.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is I think the intention of that maybe wasn't, I mean, maybe it was for this one, but it definitely has to be in there for future amendments, or there should be nothing in there about amending it, and any amendment should be by virtue of a charter change, right? So a couple of ways to look at that, but yeah, I don't think you all should be voting on your salaries, and I don't think you technically are in the context whereby the state has to approve it and the voters have to approve it, right? So I think what you're doing is voting on a proposal that they can either accept or decline. So that's what I would say to that.
Let me get my hand up. To that point, Councilor Rollins, another thing too that's important, and I'm not trying to take benefits away from people, believe me, and I don't think people run for this office for the benefits. Maybe in the past they have. But the point of us getting a stipend was also to coincide with, it does not come with benefits or eligible for the pension system. And I want to make sure that that is legally something we can do. for example, if we were to get paid $5,000 or more, that does qualify someone for benefits. Is there an additional home rule charter we would have to put forth to put some weight to that, or is this sufficient just in the language?
Yeah, I mean, I probably would do it by charter change because
Right.
that's pretty significant, right?
Yeah.
You're talking a whole separate issue, right? And so it almost would make sense to have that voted on in the same way, right? Because I think packaging them together is a little bit deceptive that, okay, well, it's a $3,000 stipend. Well, if you're getting benefits, that's not a as you
Right.
astutely point out when we do contract negotiations, right? So I think that's a really good point, and it probably makes sense if that's the intent to have it as a separate charter change and have it spelled out. I mean, it doesn't hurt to have these things spelled out in the charter and voted on by the voters, because then we know how we're operating in the future.
So
Thank you.
Attorney Rollins, quick question on that. If our intent is for a stipend without any benefits, can it be added? Can that language be added in Article 2, Section 212, specifically saying, and I'm paraphrasing here, each council shall receive an annual stipend of $3,000. No counselor will be eligible for any, retirement benefits,
Yes.
things of that nature. So
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, so
That's fine. Yep.
So I think what we can do in rules and procedures is build in language that is overt about whatever we get. It doesn't come with benefits, doesn't come with pension, things of that nature. So I think that kind of answers what you're saying, Dennis, is in there, we get paid, but we don't get anything else.
Yes.
I still want to go to the MMA conference in January, though.
Gonna be virtual, so it won't be a problem.
You're gonna have to appropriate your own money for that.
But I guess the other thing in that too, and there are some questions, and Attorney Rollins, I mean, do we have to get into the mechanics of how we get paid? In regards to, is it monthly? Is it quarterly? Is it annual? I mean, you don't
can.
have to have it in the chart. We don't have to have it in the charter.
No, I
Okay.
don't think so. I think what you could do, as long as you have it written in that that's the amount, that's the stipend, you probably can direct through the admin code, the manner in which it's
Okay.
paid, or probably even just through simple policy, right?
Yeah, okay.
It doesn't have to be explicit. That being said, the policy has to allow for, and this is where it kind of that question actually gets somewhat interesting, is what if someone, serves a partial term, right? What if they're, so there may be some, either policies in place that, spread that out in a certain way, or, or you can make it explicit if it's something that you already have ideas about and say, we can just draft this into the charter. That's fine. But I think it can be done by policy. I do worry about, like I said, partial, if you only serve half a term, do you get $3,000? I don't know.
You can put that in the admin code and have people paid monthly. So
Yeah,
anyway, okay.
Exactly. All right.
Okay, so maybe just to summarize what I've heard so far. So I think we're saying we want to keep an annual stipend of $3,000. Make sure the language says they're not eligible for any city provided benefits or pension. And I think those are the core pieces we want to bring back to rules and procedures. Anything beyond that I missed?
I think it should be 6,000, but that's okay.
All right, moving on.
All right, the next one, this is reduce the number of voters that are needed to recall an at-large counselor from 500 to 400. And then there was some additional language changes.
So before you get into this, so this is one of those ones where I think the Charter Review Committee was using a red line. We don't actually have a recall provision in our charter. So I think this would have to be a whole new section of the charter relative to recall. I think what they accidentally did was they took what the prior charter review committee did for a proposal on recalls. And they edited that, they redlined the proposal. So we don't have, I mean, we've had litigation about this, but we don't have an actual recall provision in our charter itself. So just so you all know that it would actually have to be, it would have to be a whole new section of the charter. It wouldn't be amending anything.
Thank you. Counselor Wood?
Yeah, thanks. You know, that makes sense if they were using a version from our Rules and Procedures Committee back in 2017, I think got that. So one thing I'm concerned about as we go through, and we were a little bit concerned there. So we do have a recall provision in Bridgewater. We did have legal action based on that, and you know, court cases, et cetera. And so I think it's Special Acts of 1990, if I recall. So what we had done back in 2017 is we had tried to pull the language as it exists into the charter. And I don't recall exactly what changes we made, if any. And so dropping the, you know, the voter count from 500 to 400, I think that needs to have a close look at what exists today as a special act at the state, what was proposed in the last charter, and where we get to. And you know, there were a couple touch points that were at issue. One was, and we had it solved by the court system, what 10% meant. You know, when looking at the 10% rule, for example, in the district. But you know, what it came down to is that, and again, intention here, at the district level, the way we're currently constructed, it could be really easy to recall a district representative with just a couple hundred people opposed to that representative. And that's actually a large number within a district anyway, because you know that's large for a count of voters. At large, and this is something to think about in Rules and Procedures, at large, it's nearly impossible to recall an at-large person because of the amount of votes that you need and signatures. So I think it just a bunch of work needs to be done with, look at what's currently at the state, look at what was, you know, proposed before, and then see how it makes sense. And there are reasonable numbers in there. And I think the provision as a concept is great, because you want to be able to undo, you know, something that's horribly wrong at the point before an election. And no judgment on prior issues, but you know, I don't know where that 500 and 400 came from. It didn't ring a bell with me.
Thank you, Councilor Wood. Anyone else? Okay, so I think our to-do on this one is a deep dive to make sure we understand the intent and also understand what is or isn't in place today, and introduce this as a new section. Does that sound right to everyone? Anyone who doesn't think that's right? Okay. All right, we've got two more. The next one is it establishes the town manager to a maximum 5-year renewable term. So it puts a limit in the charter on maximum of 5 years. And then there's also a statement in there that says the town manager must serve at the will of the council. I don't know if that actually made it into the ordinance though. Let's see. No, the ordinance is just the 5-year renewable term. Any concern with that?
Well, I guess I don't know. I mean, he always serves at the will of the council, but I would worry about what that means as it relates to contracts that you all want to enter into and with this or any other town manager. I don't know what that term means, and I would be very hesitant to have it in the charter, because I don't know that you're going to find a potential town manager that's going to sign a contract that says, well, I just serve at their will, unless it's an at-will employee, which town managers in Massachusetts typically aren't. So I would just, I'd be careful with that. I'm not sure what that means. And I would want to know very specifically what that means, what it means for you all, what it means for a potential employee of the town, how that would have to be implemented into a contract with that potential employee. Because I don't want to be in litigation over at will of the council. I don't know what that means. So that's all I would say. If you're gonna do something like that, I think it has to be very well defined, and you have to be ready to have candidates in the future potentially turn you down if it's something that limits their ability to do what they need to do. Other than, of course, you guys are their boss, right? I mean, to some degree, everyone serves at your will, who's a town manager. But I just, that term is a term of art in the law, and it relates to an at-will employee. So if they're under a contract, they're not an at-will employee. So I have some, it's a little bit contradictory. So just, I would be careful with that.
Okay, and the ordinance itself actually didn't include that language. It
Oh,
wasn't-
good. Okay. All right. All right.
Yeah.
I feel better.
I was gonna say.
Okay.
Councilor Wood?
So a question to Attorney Rollins. I thought there was already Mass General Law, something about contracts with this type of position,
Yes,
as you can't exceed 5 years anyway.
correct. That's right.
So again, it probably doesn't add value to say a maximum of 5 years if we can't do it by Mass General Law trumps our charter every day.
All right, any other comments? Okay, so the question on this one is, do we need it, or are we already covered by Mass General Law? All right, we're on the last one. and this-
Maybe Eric is a suggestion, because I know there's other places where MGL is referenced. Maybe inserting the reference to that limitation might be a good idea.
Yeah, great. Great, okay, we'll grab that and put that in. All right, and then the last one sets a similar term limit of 5 years for the city attorney. And
So
changes the
it's-
title to city solicitor.
So Attorney Rollins, you're an employee at will, correct?
Yes, correct.
So, and again, what Dennis and I just passed along, to be honest, I don't see this serving any, what's the word I'm looking for? Good purpose, or whatever the case may be, of giving a 5-year renewable term on an employee at will. So I don't really, personally, I don't understand the intent of this one either, because the town attorney is not contractually obligated to serve us. So
Councilor Wood?
I never took my hand out, but it's good.
Awesome.
Where is, in the current charter, I used to know this thing. Where is the section on our current town solicitor? Because I thought in our current charter, there's an appointment process that's supposed to be executed every single year.
Is it?
It's
is it-
5:30.
No, it's not. It isn't. It's basically I get appointed, or whoever gets appointed and then ratified by the council. I can tell you, I think it's 5-3.
Yeah, it is 5.
5-3.
Yeah.
It's pretty straightforward. There's not a lot of meat in there. Let's see where it is.
I see now, yeah, 5-3.
So I think it's built off the premise that the town manager hires department heads, and you all have to ratify or confirm certain department heads, obviously not all, but certain. So there's a check and balance basically built in there. So I think that's the intent. I don't.
Okay. Councilor Gallagher?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, Counselor George and I talked about this too when we were proposing these ordinances, and this is one that, I don't think really should go anywhere. I really think that, well, I think rules and procedures, I don't think the town council should be appointing the city attorney. That's the real intent here. It's taking it away from the town manager and giving the council the authority to interview and appoint a city attorney, town attorney, solicitor, we want to call our legal department. But I think this should stay within the realm of the town manager's office. And I don't think it needs to go to the voters.
Not, okay.
Well, I mean, in reality, if the council decides not to go move forward with it, it wouldn't go in front of the voters anyway.
Right.
So I think that's what you're saying, Council Gallagher, right?
Right.
I mean, it's a council's decision if the current language is sufficient to stay as is.
Right.
Okay.
Maybe it's, I mean, there's nothing to say the town manager can't, enter into a contract with the town attorney. There's nothing that stops him from doing that. But I don't think the council should be appointing the city
So-
attorney at this juncture.
And
So
so,
it's
so you guys understand, just so you kind of have like some of the behind the scenes, like for me, it's because, I mean, I guess it's fortunate for the town because they can budget right. I'm paid a stipend essentially, right? I'm not paid hourly like some towns do for their legal department or whatever. And that discussion has to come up every single year, right? As part of the budget process. So there's a lot of flexibility for a town manager to adjust, to change, to do. I mean, obviously you all have to confirm it, which is why we have the check and balance built in. But yeah, that is kind of how it works on a year-to-year basis, essentially.
So Attorney Rollins, it actually, Council Gallagher brings up an interesting point. So say, for instance, down the road, the town manager decides that he wants to put the town attorney under a contract. That contract has to come in front of us to be ratified, correct? Or can he do it on his own?
Well, I guess so. This is what's kind of weird about this clause anyway. Attorneys, other than fee agreements and fee structure, we don't have these other contractual obligations. We have the obligation to be of the utmost loyalty to our clients, right? So like we don't,
Right.
there's not all these other clauses. It's just, this is what you get paid to do this work. Just anytime you hire a lawyer, that's it, right? That's the contract. You can fire that lawyer can quit. There's always that option on both sides. So yeah, I mean, in that way, it's actually probably the most flexible contracts the town has, right? I mean,
Yeah.
the town manager tomorrow could fire me. So it's just how that works. So you're only as good as the day you're working. So, and that's how lawyers are in any realm. So just so
Okay.
you know that, I'd love to have a 5-year contract. You guys want to give me one, but I don't see that happening in other places. Just so you know, for
Right.
frame of reference.
So, all right, let me ask it a different way because that's a good point. Does the town manager arbitrarily have the ability, I can't think of the instance, but I'll ask it, where there's an employee that's, say, non-contractual that he decides to put under contract? Does that have to come in front of the town council to be ratified?
I think it depends on the employee. So you guys ratify the contracts of many of the department heads, right? So
Right.
it depends on the employee. But yeah, it's employee specific in our charter.
Okay.
It's not like
Okay.
every employee, right?
Right.
But legal counsel at the end of the day is really all, I don't want to like downplay what I am, but I'm a line item on your budget, right? Like, so that's what legal counsel is, right? So to some degrees that can go up, it can go down, but we're fortunate the way I do it with the town is like, it's steady. It's
Yeah.
pretty even. So, but in a lot of towns, what happens is if there's a lot of litigation one year, that line item goes way up, and it has nothing to do with contracts or who, got hired or fired. It just has to do with the nature of what goes on. So it's more of a budgetary thing, honestly, for legal counsel, because otherwise I'm an at-will employee. And then you guys have the check, of course. So if you don't like what the town manager does, and then the town manager at the time tries to reappoint, you can decide if you ratify or you don't ratify, right? So there's always that. I think that's what, when they did the charter originally, I think that was the point. So just so you have a little, frame of reference.
Thank you.
Any other comments on this one? Okay, so I think the takeaway here is this probably isn't applicable. So we can figure out what to do with it in the rules and procedures. All right, Mr. President, I think that completes the items that are in front of rules and procedures. Maybe if I could hand it back to you.
Excellent. Thank you, Eric. I certainly appreciate seeing this earlier today and all the work that's been put into that. And I think and hope tonight was helpful for everybody just to send some direction back to rules and procedures. And I know, talking to Councilor Souza earlier today, that we have a couple of planned rules and procedures meetings coming up to try to get these situated. And we'll start to look at some of the other proposed recommendations. So certainly appreciate
Mr. President?
it. Yes, sir.
Can I ask Attorney Rollins a question in general procedurally in regards to what we're discussing today?
100%.
Okay. So Attorney Rollins, we have the ability to, if we so choose, put these charter changes in front of the voters in a special election, correct?
Yeah. So what we would do is, first and foremost, you would vote it, but you'd be voting to send it to whichever ones. You'd be voting to send it to the legislature with the caveat in that vote that it then has to be passed by the voters. So it would go to the legislature, hopefully eventually get approved, come back to us. And then exactly, I mean, if we're in an election cycle, we could conceivably do it around that election. But if we weren't, yes, you could do it by special election. Absolutely.
Okay, good. I don't, obviously we can't discuss this. I'm going to, in regard to that, but I would put this out for the councils just to consider. I know that we are under immense pressure to make deadlines, both from the redistricting as well as we want to get, these charter changes in front of the voters as quickly as possible. I, for one, would be in full support that we look at splitting the two. And the reason for that is I think we're going to have to educate people as much on the new council and the district versus the precincts, as well as all of these changes, be able to ask questions and things like that. I would be very concerned if we're trying to do this, not only from timeline for April, understanding there's budget constraint, we'll have to appropriate funds and work with the town clerk. But I know that, there are a lot of people concerned that this is going to take way too long, but I would be in full support of splitting these two out and going forward with that. So that's just something for people to, because I'm sitting here, we have to get all of this to the legislature and they've got to, pass it. We've all gone through the issues of them dragging their feet. I think they'll do the districting real fast. I don't know about the charter review changes, and I'd like to have a little bit of leeway so that we have that flexibility of getting in front of the voters in, May or June or whatever the case may be. So I just put that out there for informational purposes, I guess.
And my advice would be, going along with that absolutely you do not package all of these charter changes with the charter changes that we need to have made for the re-precincting, because I completely agree with you that I think the re-precincting charter changes are going to be treated differently at the legislature than other ones. So I think we need to absolutely make sure that those changes get done now and are separate and distinct from these changes. I could not agree with you more on that point.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Any other discussion? Okay, seeing none, entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Have a second?
Second.
Okay, roll call vote.
Mr. George,
Yes.
Mr. Gallagher,
Yes.
Mr. Chase?
You're on mute, Fred.
Sorry, yes.
Okay, Mr. Rushton,
Yes.
Mr. Souza,
Yes.
Mr. Moore,
Yes.
and Mr. Wood.
Yes.
Meeting is over.
Happy Thanksgiving, everyone.
You too.
Yeah.
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you.
Good night.